Ladies and gentlemen, FSC members and distinguished guests, it's a great pleasure for me to take part in this event in Japan to celebrate the life of the Forest Stewardship Council. And I'm only sorry that I can't be with you personally. When I was working for the FSC, I came to meetings in Japan 3 times, but still I never managed to visit any of your forests. I expect that most of you are concentrating today on the current activities and the future prospects of the FSC, and that you are noting the changes that continue in the FSC systems and programs. But I've been asked to look back to FSC's beginnings, and even to before FSC's beginnings, to consider how and why this organization was set up, and to look again at our original aims and vision. The beginnings were near the end of the 1980s, nearly 40 years ago. By that time, public opinion and the activities of environmental organizations were already strongly focused on forests, on the reports of degradation and destruction of forests in all parts of the world, and there was special concern to save the rainforests. But their focus was mainly to put pressure on governments and timber industries, and this did not have much effect. At the same time, indigenous peoples were starting to find their voice, just starting. And they had many collaborators, strengthened by international organizations that recognized the injustices that had been inflicted on forest-dwelling peoples. And even some governments were getting worried that their own forest industries and timber supplies were threatened by the decline in their own forest resources. So there was general awareness, also encouraged by some parts of the FAO, that forestry and forest management were important not only for their commercial timber, and not only for the wildlife and biodiversity, for the soils and water, but also to ensure the supply of the whole range of people's needs for goods and services, locally and regionally. In other words, that forestry was really about satisfying all the long-term needs of people in the broadest sense. These now include climate control. There were already many national and international efforts, but it was not clear what more could be done or should be done to achieve these objectives. But then there were some new moves. Stores and shops everywhere in the world sell goods that contain wood or are made of wood, furniture, paper, kitchen items, and many other items. But typically, they had no idea of where their wood came from, no idea of the origin of the wood in the products that they sold to the public. So, environmental organizations like Greenpeace started to organize protests and demonstrations in shops and stores, including in the famous Harrods store in the center of London. These protests attracted a lot of good publicity for Greenpeace, but they were very bad for the corporate image, and those retail businesses started to get very worried. Some company managers and NGOs started to look for an answer to the crucial question: how can we possibly identify the well-managed forests where we can responsibly buy our raw materials? They urgently wanted and needed an answer to that question. People in all these kinds of organizations quickly understood that an answer would be of great commercial interest, especially to retailers, because they are in direct contact with the public, and the public was worried. But it would also be of interest to environmental and social and community interests. Perhaps the answer could be a win-win situation. So I became involved in all this because in the middle of the 1980s, I had a lot of international experience, especially in the tropics. I had lived for 8 years in Uganda, managing forest reserves for the government and doing research in tropical forest ecology for a PhD, and 3 years in Mexico, setting up a forestry faculty for a university, and consultancies in several countries for forest management and rural development projects, and research in Oxford into tropical forest silviculture. By good fortune, this brought me into contact with every sort of forest interest. Government departments as forest owners and as aid agencies, commercial timber organizations of every size, forest workers, rural communities, and environmental NGOs of every persuasion. And I was based in Oxford, which was convenient. I collaborated with Friends of the Earth to propose a project for the ITTO, International Tropical Timber Organization, to examine the elements of forest management in Malaysia. Malaysia had a good reputation, but ITTO rejected the proposal. There was a very constructive collaboration between people in WWF UK and in B&Q, a large chain store in England, and I worked with them. They noticed an effort by an importer of tropical timber called the Ecological Trading Company to set its own criteria for selecting its sources of timber in Southeast Asia. Their own criteria. They developed their own criteria. So WWF and B&Q provided some funding. Soon, the Woodworkers Alliance for Rainforest Protection, an organization of woodworkers in the USA, examined this idea, and they set up a working group to look at it. And this working group proposed that this was a job for certification. This working group determined that any forestry certification would need, first of all, a definition of what is meant by good, responsible, sustainable forestry. So, the standards. Plus, they would need evaluations by independent auditors who are not employees of the forest owner or the manager. So, there we have third-party independent evaluations by certifiers. Plus, they would need supervision of the auditors and their decisions by other independent entities, so accreditation. So work started on all that in 1990, and one of their meetings proposed a name for this task, the Forest Stewardship Council. Now, I didn't know much about certification. Certification was already widely known and used in industries, mainly for the specifications of products and industrial components of all kinds, with some movement into management systems, but not really management quality. ISO had its origins 100 years ago. Certification for organic farming and organic products has been around for 80 years now, but it was all unfamiliar in forestry. So, well, problem solved? Not at all. First of all, there were strong arguments and disagreements about what could be allowed in the standard, the definition of good forest management. Some people involved in the discussions felt that this initiative was especially for tropical forests, or just for community forests. Others felt that no harvesting should ever be certified in tropical forests, or in any unlogged natural forests anyway. Some strongly disapproved of plantations, especially exotic species. And professional foresters were often alarmed that strange new professions, like sociologists or anthropologists, would be involved in the writing of standards that they, the foresters, would have to follow. So already many people from many different interest groups and countries were involving themselves in the discussions from different angles. So a committee was set up, acting in the name of FSC. So now there was an FSC committee for a long process of negotiations. Numerous drafts of the international principles and criteria were developed and circulated and revised and circulated again, and drafts of possible statutes and bylaws. By the time of the FSC founding assembly in Toronto in 1993, 7 drafts had already been circulated worldwide, and more came later. Now, some examples of how the arguments were resolved, just as illustrations. Internationally, there was much alarm then, as there is now, about the continuing decline of tropical forests. Some activists believed that any certification that included logging in tropical forests would give credibility to this activity, which has often been extremely destructive. So it should not be certified. But then representatives of the indigenous peoples in Papua New Guinea argued that most of the forests in their country belong legally to their peoples, who had very few other resources as a basis for economic or social development. They were willing to follow the strictest requirements for forest management, but if they couldn't obtain any recognition or certification for good management, they would be at a great disadvantage in marketing their products. So these and other arguments were recognized. Plantation forestry was another area of arguments, especially with exotics. Many people were worried by their impacts on biodiversity, water supplies, and even on landscape values. But it was argued that the voluntary FSC system would have a good effect on plantations that chose to follow it. But FSC could have no possible effect on the quality of plantation management if they were not allowed in. So in the end, there was a good majority approval for including plantations with strict conditions. So finally, in 1993, the Founding Assembly was held in Toronto to launch this initiative. A few hundred delegates from many countries were invited from commercial organizations and environmental and social NGOs and academics and government organizations for 2 days of discussions. The aim was to obtain a consensus approval from the delegates to go ahead with the initiative, the FSC initiative, and to set up FSC as an organization on the basis of the agreements reached there. A crucial decision made at the Founding Assembly was that FSC should be an association of members, not a foundation, and that commercial organizations should be allowed membership. There were heated discussions because many groups with environmental and social priorities had a profound distrust of the effects of economic interests on forests. The meeting then invented, to resolve this, the meeting invented and approved a membership voting system to ensure that no particular interest group could dominate the decisions and that none could be suppressed. In this system, which has been modified from time to time during the last years, the members are allocated into one of 3 chambers: environmental, social, or economic, and into one of 2 subchambers, north and south, with a majority approval required in each one. So this association structure has been a major element for maintaining FSC's credibility, although, of course, sometimes it causes complications. In those early days, it was perhaps unusual to assign such importance to social issues, including the interests of workers, local communities, and indigenous peoples, considered together and separately. In those days, the forestry profession was still heavily oriented to sustained yield of timber as the main priority. So representatives of indigenous peoples, talking with me, from the Sami of Sweden to the Mayans of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, told me that they were very pleased to see that their traditional rights and current needs were to be respected. And equally, many professional foresters who had been worried that FSC would set excessive requirements told me that they now appeared feasible and responsible when put into practice. Feasible and responsible, but also often very complicated. Of course, after the Founding Assembly, FSC was not ready to start certification. About 2 more years of consultations with a very small staff were needed to finalize the principles and criteria to get them approved by the membership, to establish FSC as a legal entity in Mexico, quite complicated, and to develop and test a system for accreditation of independent certification organizations. These decisions have pointed me to one of FSC's major achievements. FSC certification has often been called a market-based initiative, but crucially, it has been a multi-stakeholder initiative, where standards and decision-making systems are agreed among interested and involved stakeholders. The components of FSC standards have wide recognition in government and NGOs and industries worldwide. Perhaps not as wide or as deep as we would like, but still a major achievement. And this concept of multi-stakeholder standards has been adopted in many different certification systems. The Marine Stewardship Council for Fisheries was the first to follow from about 1996. And many other large and small systems, some potentially very powerful, such as IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. They don't call it sustainable, but responsible mining. At first, it was not clear that FSC would itself set national or international standards. None of us had experience of standards, or that they would accredit the certifiers. We encouraged ISO to start developing forestry standards. I attended an ISO Congress in New Zealand, which discussed this issue and decided against it. I got the impression there that certain industries involved in extracting natural resources, such as coal, oil, and gas, were not quite ready to have their production systems examined independently with multi-stakeholder standards. I'm not quite sure that they're ready yet either. And of course, FSC continues to evolve. I'm playing a very small part in that evolution, with the beginnings of certification outside the closed timber forests, into savannas and woodlands, into arid and semi-arid regions. These often produce very important non-wood forest products, non-timber forest products. In northern Mexico, where I live, a special wax is harvested by local communities from a euphorbia shrub called candelia in the Chihuahuan Desert. Candelia wax is exported to many industries all over the world, including to Japan. It is an important ingredient in the best lipsticks. We are expecting the first community areas to receive their certification within the next couple of months. So in due course, some of you may be exposed to yet another FSC certified product, FSC certified forest product, without even noticing it. So I shall end with that personal note, and I leave to you the job of helping FSC to achieve its mission, promoting FSC certification to encourage good management of forests and forest resources. Forests for all, forever. Thank you very much indeed.